All right, welcome back, everyone. You know how this goes. We take a deep dive into a specific source to uncover all the fascinating insights. And yeah, today we're going to Finland
Finland, very interesting case study indeed.
and focusing on, well, a very comprehensive study.
Hmm.
We really try to pull out the most interesting papers for these deep dives. And this one is called, it's a bit of a mouthful.
Hmm.
It's called Energy and Industry Transition to Carbon Neutrality in Nordic Conditions via Local Renewable Sources, Electrification, Sector Coupling, and Power to X.
It really packs it all in there, doesn't it?
It does. And that's what we're going to unpack. It's all about how Finland is looking at, trying to create a low-cost, carbon-neutral energy and industry system.
Hmm.
And we should mention right off the bat that this is a 2025 paper, so pretty recent stuff.
Very much so, and it builds upon quite a few years of really interesting developments in Finland.
Yeah, and a lot of unique challenges for them, right?
Absolutely. When we talk about Nordic conditions, what we're really talking about is a place with a significant amount of energy-intensive industries.
Right, like what comes to mind there?
Oh, steel, paper production, those sorts of things.
Big industries.
Big industries, yeah.
Mm.
And on top of that, you're dealing with a climate that's not exactly ideal for something like, say, solar power,
Yeah.
right? Lots of long, dark winters.
Right. Not Spain or something.
Exactly, exactly. So they have to get creative, and that's really what this paper delves into.
So, our goal here, I think, is to really dig into what are the most surprising things? What are the real aha
Hmm.
moments? What kind of innovations are they looking at?
The things you wouldn't necessarily expect.
You're right. And, I think we'll probably touch on things like, biomass is still going to be a big player, which might surprise some folks.
It's not going away anytime soon, it seems.
Right. And then the sheer scale of renewable energy they're talking about deploying is really mind-boggling.
It is. And it really highlights the commitment Finland has made to achieving these goals.
Yeah. And then, even looking at how CO2 emissions from industry could actually be like a resource in the future.
Oh, yeah. There's some really interesting stuff in there about turning what's currently a problem
Yeah.
into a potential solution.
So let's get right into it. What are the big goals here that they're outlining in this study?
Well, the headline goal is carbon neutrality by 2035.
That's really soon.
It is. It's a very ambitious target. But the thing is, Finland isn't starting from zero. They've actually already made some pretty impressive progress.
Yeah, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, their wind power capacity, for example.
Yeah.
Back in 2010, it was practically nothing, less than zero point 0.2 megawatts.
Really? That's tiny.
Tiny. But by 2023, it had skyrocketed to over 6,700 megawatts.
Wow.
So that's like a 30,000-fold increase in a little over a decade. And now it's actually meeting more than half of their average power demand, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it.
That is pretty remarkable. It sounds like they're not slowing down either.
No, not at all. The paper mentions there's a whopping 130 gigawatts of wind power capacity in development as of late 2023. So they're clearly going all in on wind.
Wow, that's massive. And what about solar? They were talking about that much.
Solar's on the rise too, even with those long, dark winters. By the end of last year, they had over 1,000 megawatts of solar PV installed.
Okay, so it's growing, but maybe not at the same rate as wind.
Right. It's unlikely to ever be their primary source of energy, but it definitely plays a role, especially during the summer months when they have more daylight hours.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got this huge growth in renewables. What about the older power sources, the stuff they're trying to move away from?
Well, on that front, the study mentions that all the coal-fired power plants have already been shut down.
Oh, wow. So they're done with coal.
Done with coal? Yeah. And they're actually reconsidering the future of peat as well.
Peat, huh? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So peat's basically this partially decayed plant matter that they've been using for energy in Finland for quite a while. But it's pretty carbon intensive, and with all these cleaner alternatives becoming available, it seems like its days might be numbered.
That makes sense. Transitioning away from the dirtier stuff, what about nuclear? Finland's got some history there. What does the study say about that?
Yeah, so nuclear currently provides over 40% of their electricity. And they actually just brought this new plant online, Olkiluoto 3. Big, big project.
I've heard about that one. Wasn't it like way over budget and behind schedule?
It was. Years of delays and cost overruns. And the paper actually does acknowledge those challenges when it comes to building new nuclear plants.
So even though they're using a lot of nuclear now, it sounds like they're not planning to build a ton more.
Yeah, it seems like they're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. They want to evaluate the feasibility of expanding nuclear further, especially given the economic considerations.
That's interesting. So even with all this nuclear in the mix, their electricity production is already pretty clean, right?
Yeah. It's interesting, right? The paper points out that in 2023, their electricity production only emitted 38.6 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour.
That's pretty low.
Yeah, a lot lower than a lot of other developed countries. And it means they're in a pretty good position to make even more progress with their decarbonization goals.
Right, right. So they're already starting from a pretty good place. Now, we have to talk about what happened with Russia. I mean, that must have had a huge impact on Finland's energy strategy, right?
Absolutely. The paper goes into this in quite a bit of detail. Finland used to import a significant amount of energy from Russia. Electricity, natural gas, wood fuel, the whole works.
Right. And then,
And then, well, everything changed. They lost that 1.3 gigawatt power connection, the gas supply was cut off, and no more wood fuel imports either. So suddenly, energy security became a top priority.
yeah, I can imagine they had to rethink things pretty quickly.
They did. And it really pushed them to accelerate their transition to domestic energy sources. And of course, that's where this whole push for renewables and all these innovative solutions really comes into play.
Okay, so that sets the stage for us. We've talked about their goals, their starting point, and this big external shock that kind of forced them to rethink things. Now, let's dig into some of the specifics of their transition plan, as outlined in this study. Where do they see things going in the long run? Let's say by 2050.
Okay, so by 2050, they're projecting a pretty significant decrease in their overall final energy demand, something like a drop from 288 terawatt hours down to 245.
That seems counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't you expect energy demand to go up as the population grows and the economy develops?
You would think so, but there are a couple of key factors at play here. First, they're anticipating big improvements in energy efficiency, especially in buildings. So they'll be using less energy to do the same things.
Makes sense. Less waste.
Exactly. And second, the mass adoption of electric vehicles is going to play a big role. EVs are inherently more efficient than gasoline-powered cars, so that'll bring down energy demand in the transportation sector as well.
Interesting. So even though we might think more activity equals more energy, they're basically saying that efficiency gains can actually lead to a net decrease in demand.
Precisely. And that's a key finding of this study.
Okay, so we've talked about overall energy demand. What about the specific sources of energy? Where do they see that mix going?
All right, so buckle up because this is where it gets really interesting. The study outlines a few different scenarios, but let's focus on their what they call best policy scenario.
Oh.
And in this scenario, they assume no energy imports, so they're completely self-sufficient.
That's pretty ambitious, going completely self-sufficient. So what does their energy mix look like in that case?
It's a pretty dramatic shift. Fossil fuels are basically phased out entirely by 2050.
Wow.
And even biomass, while it doesn't disappear completely, its share of the pie shrinks quite a bit.
Okay, so what takes over?
Renewable electricity becomes the dominant player. They're projecting it'll jump from just 11% in 2020 to a whopping 62% by 2050.
62%. Wow. That's a huge increase. So where's all this electricity coming from?
Mostly from solar PV and onshore wind power. By 2050, solar is expected to make up 62% of their installed electricity capacity and wind another 31%.
Really? I'm surprised solar is that big given their location.
Yeah, it is interesting, but they're really banking on the continued advancements in solar technology and cost reductions to make it a major player. And of course, they have those long summer days that can be quite sunny, which helps.
Right, right. So it's a mix of both. What about offshore wind? I know some countries are really investing heavily in that.
Interestingly, offshore wind doesn't feature that prominently in their plans. The paper suggests that it's simply more cost-effective to go with onshore wind in their case. They have ample land available, and the economics just work out better.
Okay, makes sense. And what about hydro? They already have some of that, right?
They do. But they're already pretty close to maxing out their hydropower potential, so they're not expecting much growth there.
All right. So it's really solar and wind taking the lead. But those are both, intermittent sources. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. What are they doing about that?
That's a great point. And the paper actually spends a lot of time talking about the need for flexibility in the energy system. They're planning to use a combination of different approaches.
Like what?
Well, first, as we mentioned earlier, biomass is still going to be in the mix. And while its overall use will decline, it's going to play a really important role in balancing out the ups and downs of wind and solar power.
So it's like their backup plan.
Kind of, yeah. They can ramp up biomass power plants when they need extra electricity and scale them back when there's plenty of wind and solar available.
Makes sense. What else are they doing?
The other big thing is energy storage. They're expecting a huge increase in electricity storage capacity by 2050.
Oh, yeah. Storage is becoming a big deal everywhere. What kind of storage are they primarily looking at?
The paper suggests that vehicle-to-grid, or V2G systems, are going to be the dominant form of storage. Basically, this means using electric car batteries to store energy and feed it back to the grid when needed.
That's pretty cool. Your car becomes part of the energy system.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right?
Hmm.
You've got millions of electric cars sitting around, all with these batteries. Why not put them to work?
Yeah, that's really smart. Any other types of storage they mention?
Stationary batteries will also play a role, both at the utility scale and at the household level. But V2G is projected to be the biggest contributor by far.
Okay, so we've talked about electricity generation and storage. What about heating? It gets pretty cold in Finland. What are they doing about that?
They're planning a major shift towards electric heating. The study suggests that district-level electric heating systems will largely replace the current fossil fuel-based ones.
So no more burning oil or gas to heat buildings.
That's the idea. And in addition to district heating, they're also talking about deploying large-scale electric boilers for industrial heat.
Industrial heat.
Yeah, a lot of industries need heat for their processes, things like pulp in paper production, for example. And they're looking at ways to electrify that as well.
So what happens to all those combined heat and power plants, the CHPs? I know they use a lot of those in Finland.
The study actually sees a gradual phase-out of biomass-based CHPs over time.
Really? Even though biomass is supposed to be part of their flexibility strategy.
Well, it's a bit of a balancing act. While CHPs can be efficient, the paper suggests that with the increasing efficiency and decreasing cost of electric boilers, it might just make more economic sense to switch to those in the long run.
Okay, so it's a cost thing.
Yeah. And they also have to consider the carbon footprint of biomass. Yeah. Even though it's renewable, it's not completely carbon neutral.
Right, right. Makes sense. Now, what about heat pumps? Everyone seems to be talking about heat pumps these days.
They are. But the study's projections for heat pumps are a bit more, let's say, conservative.
What do you mean?
Well, they're not expecting a huge increase in heat pump capacity. They think that, at least in Finland's case, electric boilers might actually be a better fit in many situations.
Really? Why is that?
A couple of reasons. Electric boilers tend to have lower upfront costs, and they can also achieve the higher temperatures that some industrial processes require. Heat pumps can struggle with that sometimes.
Interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. It really depends on the specific application.
Okay. Let's move on to transportation. That's another big piece of the puzzle. What are they planning to do there?
This study predicts a near-complete electrification of road transportation by 2050.
So everyone driving electric cars.
Pretty much, yeah. At least for personal vehicles.
What about trucks and buses and things like that?
That's a bit trickier. For heavy-duty vehicles, they're looking at e-fuels and hydrogen as potential solutions. And those are also being considered for the marine and aviation sectors, which are even harder to electrify directly.
Right. Those are tougher nuts to crack. So we've talked about power, heat, and transportation. What about the industrial sector itself? I mean, they're big energy users. How are they supposed to decarbonize?
It's a big challenge, but the study highlights a number of strategies. They're expecting a big shift towards low-carbon production methods, things like using green hydrogen in steelmaking, electrifying industrial heat, and even using e-methanol and e-ammonia as chemical feedstocks.
Wow, so they're really trying to rethink how industries operate at a fundamental level.
They are. It's not just about switching to electric cars and putting solar panels on rooftops. It's about transforming entire industries.
So if all these projections come true, what does it mean for Finland's CO2 emissions?
The study's models show that in that best policy scenario, they could completely eliminate emissions from the power and heat sectors within the next decade.
That's amazing.
That is. Emissions from transport and industry would take a bit longer to phase out, but they're projected to reach zero by 2050.
Wow. And that aligns perfectly with their overall carbon neutrality goal, right?
Exactly. They're aiming to be completely carbon neutral by 2035, and the numbers in this study suggest it's actually achievable.
What about the interim targets? I know a lot of countries have those shorter-term goals as well.
Right. So for 2035, the study projects a 61% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to 2020 levels. So again, they're on track to meet their interim goals.
That's impressive. Now, let's circle back to that whole carbon capture thing we talked about earlier. How big of a role does the study see that playing in all of this?
They think it's going to be pretty significant. especially when it comes to producing e-fuels and e-chemicals.
And remind me, why is that important again?
Well, e-fuels and e-chemicals are essentially carbon-neutral versions of the fuels and chemicals we use today, and they can be produced using captured CO2.
Oh, right. So you're basically taking emissions and turning them into something useful.
Exactly. And the paper actually suggests that the potential for capturing CO2 from industrial sources and biomass might be so big that they wouldn't even need to rely on direct air capture, which is a much more expensive technology.
Interesting. So they could become like a net negative emitter, actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Potentially, yeah. It's pretty exciting stuff.
It is. Now, let's talk money. I mean, all of this sounds great, but it can't be cheap. What kind of investments are we talking about here?
Yeah, so the study estimates that they'll need a total of about 460 billion euros in cumulative investments between now and 2050.
460 billion, that's a lot of money.
It is. But a lot of that's going to be spread out over several decades.
Okay, that makes it a little more manageable. And where is all that money going?
The biggest chunks are going to go towards building all that new renewable energy capacity and developing the infrastructure for power to X, which includes things like electrolyzers for producing hydrogen and facilities for making e-fuels and e-chemicals.
Right, right. It's a whole new energy economy they're building. Now, I know the study looks at a few different scenarios. What are some of the other options they consider besides this best policies scenario?
Well, one of the other scenarios they analyze is one where they do allow for some energy imports.
So they're not going completely self-sufficient in that one.
No. In that scenario, they import some e-fuels, which can sometimes be a bit cheaper than producing them domestically.
Interesting. So what are the trade-offs there? Why would they choose one scenario over the other?
It comes down to balancing cost with energy security.
Right.
So relying on imports might save them some money in the short term, but it also makes them more vulnerable to external shocks like what happened with Russia.
Yeah, I get it. If you're relying on someone else for your energy, they kind of have you over a barrel.
Exactly. And that's something Finland is very conscious of. They want to be in control of their own energy destiny, even if it costs a little bit more.
That makes sense. And the study actually quantifies these costs, right? Like, what's the difference of the cost of electricity between these different scenarios?
It does. They use what's called the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, to compare the different options.
Hmm.
And what they found is that the scenario with a strong focus on local renewable energy production actually ends up having the lowest LCOE in the long run.
Really? So even though those initial investments are higher, they actually end up saving money in the long run because their electricity is cheaper to produce.
That's what the study suggests, yes.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the cost of electricity itself. They also look at the levelized cost of final energy, which takes into account all the different forms of energy used in the economy, including heat and transportation fuels. And there, they find that the scenarios with more imports tend to have higher costs because they're paying a premium for those imported e-fuels.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's a more holistic view of the costs. Now, we have to talk about the practicalities of all this. They're talking about building all this new infrastructure, connecting different parts of the country, and so on. What are some of the challenges there?
But one of the big ones is grid infrastructure. They're going to need to significantly expand and reinforce their electricity grid to handle all this new renewable energy, especially because a lot of the best wind and solar resources are located in the north and west of the country, while the biggest demand centers are in the south.
Right, so they need to get that electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed.
Exactly. And that's going to require some major investments in transmission lines.
And I imagine there are probably some logistical and geographical challenges there as well.
There are. It's not always easy to build transmission lines, especially in remote areas or across difficult terrain. And they're also going to need to make sure that the grid is robust enough to handle the intermittency of wind and solar power.
Right, so they need enough storage and backup power to keep the lights on even when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining.
Exactly.
Now, this study makes an interesting point about Finland's potential need for electricity storage.
Yeah. It suggests that they might actually need less storage than some other countries with high shares of renewable energy.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it has to do with a few factors. First, they've got that biomass backup, which provides a lot of flexibility. Second, their existing transmission grid is already pretty well developed, which allows them to move electricity around the country more easily. And third, they have some existing hydropower capacity, which can be ramped up and down relatively quickly to help balance the grid.
So they have more tools in their toolbox than some other places.
Exactly. And that means they might be able to get away with less storage, which can save them a lot of money.
That makes sense. Now, another interesting thing the study highlights is the potential dominance of electric resistive heaters for heat supply. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so electric resistive heaters are basically just big electric coils that heat up. They're really simple and relatively cheap. And this study suggests that they might actually be a better fit for a lot of heating applications than heat pumps, which are often seen as the go-to technology for decarbonizing heat.
Okay. What are the advantages of resistive heaters?
Well, as I mentioned, they're very simple and cheap to install. They also don't require refrigerants, which can be environmentally harmful. And importantly, they can reach very high temperatures, which makes them suitable for industrial processes that need a lot of heat.
So they're more versatile than heat pumps in some cases.
Exactly. And the study suggests that they could become a major player in both industrial and district heating in Finland.
Interesting. So it's not always about the fanciest, most high-tech solution. Sometimes the simpler option is better.
Exactly. And that's a good lesson to keep in mind as we think about decarbonizing our energy systems.
So big picture, what are some of the limitations of this study? Are there any caveats we should be aware of?
Yeah, the study does acknowledge a few limitations. One of the big ones is that they don't really consider the potential for future power interconnections with neighboring countries.
So they're basically assuming that Finland will be an energy island.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's not necessarily realistic. Finland is already part of the Nordic electricity market, and there's a lot of potential for increased cooperation with other countries in the future.
Right. So they might be able to import or export electricity to help balance their grid or take advantage of different price fluctuations.
Exactly. So that's something to keep in mind.
And they're not factoring in potential collaborations on things like green hydrogen production or
Right.
carbon capture and storage, right? I mean, those are areas where regional cooperation could be really beneficial.
Absolutely. And that's another limitation of the study. It takes a very national perspective, which makes sense given its focus on Finland's specific circumstances, but it doesn't fully capture the potential for international collaboration.
Right. And it's probably worth noting that the study assumes that industrial production volumes will stay pretty much constant.
Yeah, they do make that assumption. And of course, that's not guaranteed. Global markets change, technologies evolve, new industries emerge. So there's always a degree of uncertainty when you're making projections about the future.
Yeah, for sure. But even with those limitations, the study is still pretty optimistic about Finland's future, right?
It is. They see a lot of potential for Finland to not only achieve its own climate goals, but also to become a major exporter of clean energy to other parts of Europe.
Really? So they could actually turn this whole energy transition into an economic opportunity.
Exactly. They've got all these renewable resources, and they're developing expertise in things like green hydrogen and power to X, so they could become a real leader in the clean energy space.
Exciting. All right, so to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways here? What do we want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that Finland has a really solid plan for achieving carbon neutrality by 2035. It's ambitious, but it's also realistic and well thought out.
Yeah, and it's not just about switching to renewable energy, it's about transforming their entire energy system, from power generation to heating to transportation to industry.
Absolutely. And it's going to require significant investments, but it also presents some really exciting opportunities for Finland to become a leader in the clean energy economy.
And it's fascinating how they're looking at all these different pieces of the puzzle, from bioenergy to carbon capture to electric vehicles, and figuring out how to fit them all together.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive and integrated approach, and it's something that other countries can definitely learn from as they develop their own decarbonization plans.
Absolutely. All right, so here's a final thought for our listeners. Finland is doing all of this in the context of their specific Nordic challenges, but what are the broader implications of their approach for other industrialized nations? Could this be a blueprint for others? Or are there unique factors in Finland that make their plan difficult to replicate elsewhere? It's a question worth pondering.
It is, and it really highlights the need for each country to develop its own tailored decarbonization strategy, taking into account its unique circumstances and resources. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Yeah, but I think there are definitely some universal lessons to be learned from Finland's experience.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to dig into the source material and explore these issues further.
And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating and timely topic.
Until then, stay curious, folks.